Hey everybody, you see the title down below, and it basically says looking back at Saturday morning cartoons in the 80s. You know, this kind of comes from being inspired by two things. The first inspiration comes from a top 10 countdown that Huey Toonmore and Paranormal Bob did around late last year. And that was the top 10 80 cartoon intros. Another inspiration is currently from something I'm recording off on demand, which is kind of funny since I couldn't record it when it was actually being aired, but I can record it while it's being on demand, which is kind of funny. And that is the miniseries documentary, the 6-part miniseries documentary entitled The 80's, The Decade That Made Us. And you know, just by watching both of these things, and I'm sorry for the bird in the background, it kind of made me want to do something similar. Now, I tried to do this yesterday, but I couldn't, due to the fact that it was windy and everything, and essentially the battery, I think, had just died on my camera or something like that. I just couldn't really do it correctly. I just really couldn't do it correctly. So hopefully I can do it here. First of all, let me move this bird to another room before he makes a lot of noise. Sorry about that, folks. And just in case anybody's wondering, I'm an uncut kind of guy. In other words, when I do something, I leave it in, I shoot it. I'm a shooter, you know what I mean? But anyway, they both inspired me to want to do this and talk about how Saturday mornings were in the 80s. And let's face it, to quote Toonmore, he basically called the 1980s the golden age of cartoons. Now, some people might say actually the golden age of cartoons was around the 40s and the 30s and the 50s. Yeah, for theatrical, shorts and all that. But we're talking television-wise. And what you had on Saturday mornings was, during the 80s, was just beyond description at times. Because you know, people use movies like from the time of Disney's The Little Mermaid to about Mulan, maybe Tarzan at the most, but mainly Mulan, as the Disney Renaissance era in animation. So I guess you could say that the 1980s was the Renaissance era. That decade was the Renaissance era of Saturday morning cartoons. Now, they did carry over in the 1990s with several stations and stuff, but things started to change in the 90s, and I think we all noticed that. I think things changed in the 90s, and we were starting to all notice that, if you will. We were noticing it by the fact that in the 90s, you started seeing the debut of all these different cable networks out there, all these 24-hour cartoon cable channels like Cartoon Network, like its spin-off Boomerang, which came at the beginning of the 2000s. You know, in the late 90s, you had Toon Disney make its mark. You had Nickelodeon starting to get into that Saturday morning market more so with expansions of different other Nickelodeon stations. And then eventually the own Nicktoons. Then you have all the, channels that are mainly based around, anime, like Funimation and stuff that just back then in the 80s, you would have never thought was possible, never thought would happen, but yet here it is. And it's all because of the fact that there is a demand in the market nowadays for a revisiting of those Saturday morning-like environments. As a matter of fact, Saturday mornings back in the 80s and even before then was so Saturday mornings back in the 80s was so looked back upon that you have companies like Warner Brothers bringing out DVDs in volume sets of DVDs based around Saturday morning cartoons of the 80s, 70s, and 90s, 80s, 70s, and 60s, which is kind of cool. Just checking, seeing my dog was barking at. But again, you have companies like Warner Brothers doing that. Now I know everybody's ultimate dream someday is for whatever studio out there, whether it's an independent studio, whether it's a major studio or company or independent company, to get the rights, at least for one time only, to release a set Saturday morning set of all of the cartoons you saw on Saturday mornings. That's what people hope for. The question is whether or not they'll get it is totally up in the air. But you see, that's the impact that the 80s Saturday morning cartoons have. Now, I'm not saying that the weekdays, mornings and afternoons cartoons of the 80s, didn't have an impact. They did. They did have an impact. There's no doubt about it. They had an impact. And even Sunday mornings. But the thing is, despite what you got during the weekdays, it was Saturday mornings that you always looked forward to. In fact, every time you went, every time you went right back into the the fall season, usually around the first or second Friday of that month, every network from ABC to NBC to CBS would have would dedicate a half hour of the Friday night schedule to a sneak preview of the next day's new lineup, the next day, the Saturday morning's new lineup for the network. They would dedicate an entire half hour, sometimes maybe even an hour at times to do this. In fact, they even did something one time, and I think you can find it here on YouTube. NBC did something to where they involved a lot of the cast and characters. They even brought in the live action, the girl that played the live action Punky Brewster doing one of these, if you will. This was just. And that was the thing too about these primetime preview specials. Not only did it allow you to see what was going to be coming in the next day, but they used the cast. They used the cast of one of the more successful primetime shows. They did. There were times, I remember one year, and there were times that you would have that cast interact story-wise with what was going on. And again, I'm pretty sure you can find some of those here on YouTube. But that was the impact. And yes, like I said, it did carry on into the early to mid-90s, and then it kind of started to die down, and we kind of have what we have now. But still, it was huge, huge impact. And, I'm not saying that the late 50s, 60s, and the 70s didn't, didn't have an impact of their own. The 50s, to me, the late 50s on Saturday mornings, ladies and gentlemen, was basically, they were the starting block. They were the foundation that was laid down for what Saturday mornings were going to be. The 60s continued to build on that foundation. They started to lay down the ground. Well, actually, to be more specific, the late 50s laid down the groundwork of what Saturday mornings were going to be. The 60s started to bring in and started to put the foundation of that groundwork, started to put the physical foundation of that groundwork together. They started to build up, if you will. They put the cement down. They put everything. Like when you're building a house or a building, the first things you do is you get the groundwork, you get the plans, the blueprints, the groundwork done, and that was what the 50s did. You had the 50s were the blueprints and the groundwork for the Saturday mornings. And when the 60s came around, they basically started, they were like you were putting in after you did the groundwork and everything, you had the blueprints and you started doing the groundwork. The 60s were kind of like putting that cement down, putting that first layer of cement down to solidify that foundation. And then the 70s really started to capitalize on it by continuing to build on top of that foundation with what they had. And in the 80s is when that entire thing was complete. The 80s basically was like when a building is finally completed and finally open for business. That's how it is. An example being when this Walmart first got talked about, the Walmart here in Patterson was first talked about to become a reality, was first brought up and talked about to become a reality. The first things that went into it were meetings and all that, but plan-wise, the groundwork had to be broken. The ground had to be broken first before the blueprint. Well, actually, the blueprints had to be looked up first, had to be made first, and then the ground had to be broken, and the groundwork had to begin. That's kind of how Saturday mornings work. And even though it took a little over a year before the whole thing was complete, the day. That's my dog. But the day it was all finally completed, which was the day it was finally completed, and the day it finally opened, which was January of this year. You can look that up on my channel. On January 20-something, again, you gotta look it up on my channel. That, my friends, was a day people had been looking forward to for years. And in a strange way, that's how Saturday mornings were. Like I said, the 50s were like having the blueprints and the ground broken, and the groundwork being done. You had the 60s being like, being built upon, had that cement being, that had some of that cement and the wood being put up and everything. The wood and not just the wood, but the wood and the bars and all that being put up, the steel bars. And then the 70s were like you were finally putting the layers on top. You were putting layer after layer on top of that building to solidify its strength. And then when the 80s came, it was basically bam. That's basically what it was. Basically bam. The 80s were like the Walmart here in Patterson finally opening for business. It was something that a lot of people have been waiting for and hoping for, and that's what Saturday morning cartoons were. They were based in the 80s. They were basically, when they started, bam, it was like the first day that Walmart opened here in town. It's like the first day anything like that happens. It was basically the start of something new and something fresh, and something that people have been wanting for quite some time, and that's what Saturday morning cartoons in the 80s were. In fact, that's what cartoons in the 80s were overall, but Saturday mornings were mostly the ones that solidified that. They were the ones that solidified it the most. and you had 3 networks that basically helped complete that construction